At 2:30 a.m. on the 29th of May 1453, the defenders of Constantinople heard a sound they had dreaded for 53 days. It was not the roar of cannon or the clash of steel, but something quieter and more final, the chanting of the Ottoman army, rising from the darkness beyond the great walls. The soldiers inside knew what it meant. The final assault had begun. On the other side of those walls, Sultan Mehmed II had gathered somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 men. For weeks, his artillery had pounded the ancient fortifications. The largest cannon in history, forged by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, had fired stones weighing over 1,000 pounds at the same section of wall day after day. The defenders, outnumbered at least 10 to 1, had repaired the breaches each night with timbers, earth, and desperation. But now the repairs could not keep pace. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine the 11th had been the last ruler of a dying state. On that final night, he stood with his soldiers near the gate of St. Romanus, the most vulnerable point in the walls. He knew the empire had no relief force coming. The Venetian and Genoese ships that might have helped were either blockaded or had already sailed away. Western Christendom had promised aid, but that promise had never arrived. The siege had begun on the 6th of April, and for 7 weeks the Byzantines had held. But by May 29th, exhaustion had hollowed out the defenders. The wall that had stood for over 1,000 years was about to fall. At 3 a.m., the first wave of Ottoman irregulars surged forward. They were not the elite soldiers but the conscripted men of the Bashibazouks, sent to tire the defenders and absorb the opening volleys. The Byzantines fought them back with crossbows, boiling oil, and desperate strength. But the Ottomans rotated fresh troops in, wave after wave, and as the sky began to lighten, the elite Janissaries advanced. They were the Sultan's household troops, professional soldiers trained from childhood, armored in chain mail and armed with bows and scimitars. Around 4:30 a.m., a small postern gate near the Blascherny sector of the walls was discovered to have been left unlocked. Ottoman soldiers pushed through and climbed onto the inner ramparts. A flag was raised. Panic spread through the defending lines. And then, somewhere around 5:30 a.m., the main gate was breached. Constantine the 11th, legend says, threw off his imperial regalia and charged into the breach with a handful of his remaining soldiers. He was never seen again. His body was never identified. What happened? The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman army on that spring morning ended a political entity that had lasted for more than 1,000 years. The Byzantine Empire, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, had been the direct continuation of the Roman state that had ruled the Mediterranean from Augustus onward. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the eastern half survived. Its capital, Constantinople, had been founded by the Emperor Constantine the Great in 330 A.D., built on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. For 11 centuries after that, it remained the center of a civilization that preserved Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Orthodox Christianity, while much of Europe descended into the fragmentation of the early Middle Ages. By the year 1453, however, the empire had shrunk to almost nothing. At its height under emperors such as Justinian in the 6th century and Basil II in the 11th, it had stretched from Spain to the Euphrates, from the Danube to the Nile. But by the 15th century, it consisted only of the city itself and a few scattered territories in the Peloponnese. The rest had been lost to centuries of invasion, civil war, and economic decline. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 delivered a particularly devastating blow. Western crusaders had sacked Constantinople, burning churches, plundering the imperial treasury, and dividing the empire among themselves. It took nearly 60 years for the Byzantines to reclaim their capital, but they never recovered the strength or wealth they had before. The final decline began in earnest after the Black Death, which killed perhaps half the population of the city in the 1340s. Trade routes had shifted away from Constantinople toward Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa. The empire's armies had become small and poorly equipped. Its navy was almost non-existent. And by the 1410s, the Ottoman Turks had already surrounded the city on all sides, controlling the land routes into Thrace and the sea approaches through the Dardanelles. How could a state that had endured so long collapse so completely? The answer lies in a series of systemic failures that compounded over centuries. The Byzantine Empire's taxation system became increasingly inefficient as the land-based aristocracy gained power and evaded fiscal obligations. The imperial bureaucracy, once the most sophisticated in the medieval world, grew corrupt and self-serving. Military recruitment, once based on the old Roman legions and then on the powerful theme system of provincial armies, degenerated into reliance on hired mercenaries who were often disloyal or ineffective. And the empire's diplomacy, which for centuries had played rival powers against each other with remarkable skill, eventually ran out of players to manipulate. By the end, there was no ally left strong enough or willing enough to help. The siege itself revealed deeper failures. The walls of Constantinople had been considered impregnable for 1,000 years. They had withstood sieges by Avars, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Russians. But gunpowder artillery had changed warfare in ways the walls were never designed to resist. The Ottoman cannons, especially the great bombard built by Urban, could breach sections of stone wall that had never been breached before. The defenders had no comparable artillery to counter the bombardment. They also had too few men to cover the entire length of the walls, which stretched for more than 12 miles. Some sections were guarded by only a handful of soldiers, many of them elderly or wounded. The Ottomans simply massed their forces at the weakest points. When investigators of the 19th century sifted through the historical accounts, they found another layer of missed signals. The Byzantine emperors in the final decades had repeatedly appealed to the papacy in Rome for military aid. But the price of that aid was religious submission. The Orthodox Church would have to accept the authority of the Pope. In 1439, the Council of Florence produced a union of the two churches, but the union was deeply unpopular in Constantinople. Many citizens and clergy preferred Ottoman rule to union with the hated Latins. The Emperor John VIII, Constantine's predecessor, had agreed to the union in hopes of a crusade. But when the promised crusade finally came in 1444, it was crushed by the Ottomans at the Battle of Varna. After that, no Western power was willing to send troops. The Byzantines were left alone. Meanwhile, the Sultan Mehmed II had been preparing for this campaign since he took the throne in 145. He built a fortress called Rumeli Hisari on the European shore of the Bosporus, directly across from the existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian shore. This gave him complete control of the straits. He recruited engineers, built a fleet, stockpiled powder and shot, and studied the city's weaknesses. He understood that the Golden Horn, the natural harbor that protected Constantinople's north side, was critical. So he did something unprecedented. He had his ships dragged overland on greased logs, bypassing the massive chain that the Byzantines had stretched across the harbor entrance. The sight of Ottoman ships sailing into the Golden Horn on the morning of April 22nd broke the morale of many defenders. It was a tactical move that no Byzantine planner had anticipated. The question that has haunted historians ever since is whether the fall could have been prevented. If the defenders had sealed that unlocked postern gate, could the walls have held one more day? If the emperor had accepted complete submission to the Pope earlier, would a crusade have arrived? If the empire had reformed its economy and military in the 14th century instead of the 15th, could it have survived the Ottoman advance? These are not only historical questions. They are questions about how systems erode, how warning signs are ignored, how decisions made decades earlier can cascade into the destruction of a civilization. After the fall, the city was sacked for 3 days according to Ottoman custom. Many thousands were killed or enslaved. The great church of Hagia Sophia, built by Justinian in 537 AD, and the largest cathedral in the world for nearly 1,000 years, was converted into a mosque. Its mosaics of Christ and the Virgin were covered with plaster. Libraries were burned. Statues were melted down. The imperial treasures were carried away to Edirne and later to Istanbul, the new name the Sultan gave to the city. The Byzantine Empire, which had outlasted the Western Empire by nearly 1,000 years, ceased to exist. And yet the story does not end with destruction. The legacy of Byzantium survived in the Orthodox Church, in the legal codes of Russia and the Balkans, in the art and architecture of the Renaissance that had been influenced by Byzantine scholars fleeing to Italy. The empire's long history offers a cautionary tale about institutional decline, but also a testament to resilience. For more than a millennium, a state that began as the eastern half of the Roman world preserved learning, law, and faith, while empires around it rose and fell. Its end was brutal. Its memory endures. At 2 in the morning on May 29th, 1453, the silence around Constantinople broke. Ottoman drums began to beat. War cries rose from tens of thousands of throats. Lanterns flickered across the hills beyond the Theodosian walls. Inside the city, the Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos had already taken his position near the gate of St. Romanus. He knew what was coming. The final assault had begun. The Ottoman attack came in 3 waves. The first wave consisted of irregular troops known as the Azabs. They were sent forward to exhaust the defenders, to soak up arrows and bolts and gunfire. They advanced with ladders and grappling hooks. The defenders on the walls, perhaps 7,000 men in total, including perhaps 2,000 foreign volunteers from Venice, Genoa, and elsewhere, met them with everything they had. Greek fire, crossbows, boiling oil, stones. The Azabs broke after about 2 hours. Thousands lay dead at the base of the walls. But the defenders had spent their ammunition. Their arms ached. Some of them had been fighting for nearly 6 weeks already, sleeping on the battlements, eating whatever could be found. The walls had been pounded by Ottoman artillery for weeks. The great bombard had to be cooled with oil after each shot to prevent it from cracking, but it had done its work. Some sections of the wall were already reduced to rubble, temporarily repaired with timber and earth. The repairs held during the first wave, but they would not hold forever. The second wave came from the Anatolian troops, disciplined soldiers of the Ottoman Sultan. They advanced in tight formations, carrying scaling ladders, grappling hooks, and bundles of brushwood to fill the moats. This wave was repulsed too, but only barely. At the critical section near the gate of St. Romanus, the defenders were led by a Genoese condottiero named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a man experienced in siege warfare. He commanded a picked force of Genoese and Greek soldiers. Under his direction they held the line, but Giustiniani himself was hit. Accounts differ on whether he was struck by a crossbow bolt, a bullet, or a fragment of stone. What is certain is that he was wounded seriously and had to be carried away from the wall. His retreat caused panic. The defenders saw their commander leaving and assumed the worst. The third wave hit at that moment. The Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman Empire, trained from childhood in the Devshirme system, had been held in reserve. They advanced now. They found a gate, the Kirkaporta, which had been left unsecured. Some accounts say it was a postern gate used by the defenders for sorties and simply left unlocked. Others suggest it was the gate of the wooden circus. The Janissaries poured through. The battle turned into a rout. The Emperor Constantine, seeing the breach, rushed to confront the Janissaries. He threw off his imperial insignia so he would not be recognized and captured alive. He and his small bodyguard charged into the mass of Ottoman soldiers. They were overwhelmed. His body was never positively identified. According to legend, an Ottoman soldier killed him without knowing who he was. The emperor's head was later presented to Mehmed II, who ordered it displayed on the hippodrome. The city had fallen, But the fighting did not stop immediately. Pockets of resistance fought on throughout the morning. Some citizens barricaded themselves in their houses. Others fled toward Hulbert Sophia, hoping that the prophecy that angels would come to save the city would be fulfilled. It was not. Ottoman soldiers broke down the doors of the great church. Thousands who had taken refuge inside were enslaved or killed. The priests, still in their vestments, were taken away. The building was stripped of its treasures. What happened in the hours after the fall? How did the system of governance and civilization that had lasted for more than a millennium come to this end so abruptly? Investigators of history have reconstructed the events with the same precision as a modern accident investigation. They have identified at least 5 distinct failures that contributed to the catastrophe. First, the empire had no strategic depth. By 1453, Constantinople was a city alone. The provinces that once supplied its grain, timber, and soldiers were gone. The Peloponnese remained under Byzantine control, but it had been devastated by Ottoman raids and internal conflict. The emperor's brother Demetrios ruled the Mora as a vassal of the Sultan, unable to send aid. The empire had no navy to speak of. The few ships that remained were Genoese or Venetian, not Byzantine. Second, the walls had been neglected for generations. The Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century, had always been the best defensive works in Europe, but they required constant maintenance. The stones needed to be repointed. The towers needed to be repaired. The moats needed to be dredged. By the 1440s, sections of the walls had collapsed from disuse. The imperial treasury could not afford the labor or materials. The empire's tax base had evaporated. In the final decades, the emperor had resorted to melting down church plate to pay his soldiers. Third, the religious schism crippled diplomacy. The Union of Florence in 1439 had been a political necessity for John VIII, but it was a spiritual scandal for many Byzantines. The Orthodox patriarchs of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem repudiated the union. The monastic communities of Mount Athos refused to accept it. When the Emperor Constantine the 11th read the decree of union in Hagia Sophia in December 1452, it was met with open hostility. The citizens and clergy shouted, "Better the turban of the Sultan than the mitre of the Pope." That sentiment, however understandable as a defense of Orthodox identity, destroyed any chance of meaningful Western military aid. The papacy sent a few ships and a small number of volunteers, but no army. The crusade mentality had died at Varna in 1444. Fourth, the Ottomans outclassed the Byzantines in military technology and organization. The Great Bombard was only one example. The Ottomans had also mastered the art of sapping. Throughout the siege, Ottoman miners dug tunnels beneath the walls, attempting to collapse them from below. The defenders, led by the Scottish engineer Johannes Grant, succeeded in countermining and flooding the tunnels, but the effort exhausted resources and manpower. The Ottomans also employed archers, crossbowmen, handgun shooters, and artillery in coordinated attacks. The defenders could match one or two of these, but not all simultaneously. Fifth, and perhaps most important, the Byzantine population had lost its will to fight. The city's population had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 by 1453, down from perhaps 500,000 in the 12th century. Many of those who remained were elderly, sick, or refugees from Ottoman-conquered territories. The emperor appealed repeatedly for volunteers, but the response was weak. Some neighborhoods provided only a handful of men. The church, which initially had supported the defense, became a source of division. The Orthodox clergy who opposed the union refused to cooperate with the emperor. Some even welcomed the Ottoman takeover as a lesser evil than submission to the papacy. When investigators of the 19th and 20th centuries examined these failures, they found a pattern of systemic collapse that matched many other fallen empires. The same warning signs had appeared in Rome before its fall: reliance on mercenaries, corrupt bureaucracy, shrinking tax base, religious division, and loss of civic spirit. The Byzantine Empire had survived for centuries by evolving and adapting. In the end, it stopped adapting. It could no longer reform its institutions, attract enough soldiers, or command the loyalty of its people. The immediate consequences of the fall were profound. The Ottoman Empire absorbed Constantinople and made it its new capital, renaming it Istanbul. The Sultan repopulated the city by force, bringing in Turks, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews from other parts of his empire. He converted Hagia Sophia into a mosque, but allowed the Orthodox Church to continue functioning under a new patriarch, carefully controlled. The Byzantine refugees who fled to Italy brought with them ancient Greek manuscripts that had been lost to the West for centuries. These manuscripts fueled the Italian Renaissance, influencing scholars like Leonardo Bruni and Erasmus. The knowledge preserved in Constantinople's libraries, the works of Aristotle, Plato, Homer, and the Greek historians, were translated into Latin and spread across Europe. The loss of the city was a trauma for the Christian world, but it also spurred the age of discovery. Europeans began looking for new trade routes to Asia, routes that bypassed Ottoman territory. That search led directly to the voyages of Columbus and da Gama. The question of whether the empire could have been saved is not merely academic. It reveals the nature of historical inevitability. Some scholars argue that the Ottoman conquest was inevitable given the disparity in resources. In 1400, the Ottoman Empire controlled an army that could field 100,000 men. The Byzantine Empire could barely field 10,000. The Ottomans had a centralized treasury, a modern bureaucracy, and a unified religious establishment that supported the state. The Byzantines had none of these. They had only the memory of greatness, the walls, and a few thousand exhausted defenders. But others point to specific moments when the outcome might have been different. If the Union of Florence had been genuinely accepted, perhaps a large crusade could have been assembled before 143. If the empire had reformed its tax system in the 14th century, it might have afforded a standing army. If the Fourth Crusade had not sacked Constantinople in 1204, the empire would have been far stronger. Each of these moments represents a branching path. In the end, the empire took the wrong path at every critical juncture. The aftermath of the fall was not only felt in the East. In the West, the news shocked the courts of Europe. The Pope called for a new crusade, but no one acted. The kingdoms of England and France were entangled in the Hundred Years' War. The Holy Roman Empire was fragmenting. Italy was divided among city-states. The Habsburgs would later stop the Ottomans at Vienna in 1529, but by then the Byzantine Empire was 60 years gone. The balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted permanently. The Ottomans became a naval power, controlling the eastern Mediterranean and threatening Venice. The age of city-states gave way to the age of empires. And what of the people who lived through it? The ordinary citizens of Constantinople, not the emperors or the generals, but the bakers, the fishermen, the priests, the women, the children. Many were killed in the sack or sold into slavery. Those who survived became subjects of an Islamic empire, their taxes now paid to the Sultan, their churches turned into warehouses or mosques. They adapted as people always do. They learned Turkish. They paid the jizya, the tax on non-Muslims. They continued to practice their faith in secret or in public, depending on the Sultan's mood. The Orthodox Church survived, but it was now subordinated to the state. The great monasteries and libraries of the empire were looted or destroyed. The knowledge that had been preserved for 1,000 years was scattered to the winds. Some of that knowledge survived in unexpected ways. The Christian communities of the Ottoman Empire, the Rum Millet, continued to produce scholars and scribes. The monasteries of Mount Athos, despite centuries of hardship, preserved their manuscripts into the modern era. The Greek Orthodox Church became the custodian of Byzantine tradition. Even today, the liturgy of the Orthodox Church contains hymns and prayers that were composed in Constantinople in the 5th and 6th centuries. The music, the art, the architecture, all bear the imprint of a civilization that believed itself to be the new Rome. The story of the Byzantine Empire is not only a story of decline and fall, it is also a story of resilience. For 1,000 years, a state that lacked the resources of its neighbors managed to stay alive. Its diplomacy was a masterpiece of statecraft. Its legal system was so advanced that it influenced the laws of Russia and the Balkans for centuries after the empire itself was gone. Its art transformed the way Europe saw the divine. Its theology shaped the course of Christian thought. The fall of Constantinople was a tragedy, but the empire's legacy outlasted the walls. In the end, what investigators of history find when they look at the empire is not a simple moral about decline. They find a complex system of interlocking factors: trade, religion, military, economics, culture, all interacting over centuries. The empire fell because it could not adapt to changing conditions. but it lasted as long as it did because it had adapted before. The same flexibility that allowed it to survive the Arab invasions, the iconoclast controversy, the Crusader sack, and the Black Death finally gave out. The system collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. So when we ask how the Byzantine Empire fell, we are also asking how any system fails. The answer is that systems fail slowly, then all at once. The signs are there, but they are ignored. The resources are depleted. The will to continue fades. And then at 2 in the morning on a May day in 1453, a gate is left unlocked, a commander is wounded, and the walls that have stood for 1,000 years come crashing down. At 2 in the morning on the 29th of May 1453, the Ottoman army began its final assault on the walls of Constantinople. The attack had been planned for weeks. Sultan Mehmed II had assembled his best troops, his elite janissaries, and positioned them behind the front lines. The first wave consisted of irregular infantry, the Azaps, men who were considered expendable. Their orders were to exhaust the defenders. Behind them came the Anatolian regiments, better trained and better equipped. And behind them, held in reserve, were the janissaries, the Sultan's own household troops, hardened by years of war. For hours the defenders held. The walls had been damaged by weeks of bombardment, but the gaps had been repaired each night. The garrison, perhaps 7,000 men at most, fought with desperation. They knew there would be no reinforcements. No Venetian fleet was coming. No papal army was marching. It was only them and the walls. At around 4 in the morning, a small gate called the Kirkaporta, located near the Blascherny section of the walls, was found to be open. It had been used by the defenders for sorties against the Ottoman sappers. In the chaos of the fighting, someone had failed to lock it. Accounts differ on exactly who. Some say it was left open by accident. Others suggest a traitor. The Ottoman soldiers quickly noticed the opening and poured through. Within minutes, they were inside the outer wall. The commander of the Genoese contingent, Giovanni Giustiniani, was wounded in the fighting. He was struck by a crossbow bolt or a bullet, depending on the source. He was carried away from the walls by his men. The Byzantine Emperor, Constantine XI, saw the breach and rushed to defend it. He fought in the streets, but he was overwhelmed. His body was never identified. By 6 in the morning, the city was lost. The Ottoman soldiers began the sack. For 3 days, the terms of Islamic law allowed the conquerors to plunder, kill, and enslave. The population of the city, what remained of it, was taken captive. Some were killed outright. Others were marched to slave markets in Edirne and Bursa. The great churches were looted. Hagia Sophia, the cathedral of holy wisdom, was stripped of its gold, its icons, its relics. The building was converted into a mosque the same day. The Sultan himself walked into the building, ordered an imam to recite the call to prayer, and thus declared it an Islamic house of worship. What happened next set the course for centuries of history. The fall of Constantinople did not happen in isolation. It was the culmination of a long series of failures, each one documented, each one avoidable in theory, but compounded by circumstance. When investigators of history and military strategy examined the siege, they found a pattern of missed signals and institutional paralysis that had been building for decades. The first failure was diplomatic. For more than a century, the Byzantine emperors had begged the West for help. The price of Western aid was the reunification of the Orthodox and Catholic churches. In 1439, at the Council of Florence, the Byzantine delegation agreed to the union. But when the delegates returned to Constantinople, the population rejected it. The clergy who had signed the union were denounced as traitors. The emperor himself, John VIII, lost credibility. When his successor, Constantine XI, came to the throne, he faced a city divided, a small group of Unionists who looked to Rome, and a large group of anti-Unionists who preferred Ottoman rule to Latin domination. In 1452, when maimed II began building the fortress of Rumeli Hisari on the European shore of the Bosphorus, the Byzantines understood what it meant. The fortress controlled the narrow strait. It cut off the city from grain shipments from the Black Sea. The emperor sent desperate appeals to Venice, to Genoa, to the Pope. Some ships arrived, but not enough. A Venetian fleet was delayed by weather and indecision. It never reached Constantinople before the siege began. The second failure was military. The Byzantine army had been reduced to a few thousand men, many of them mercenaries. The regular army had been disbanded for lack of funds. The famed Varangian Guard, the Norse and Anglo-Saxon elite troops, had long since dissolved. The walls themselves, though massive, had been designed for medieval warfare, not for gunpowder artillery. The Ottomans brought a Hungarian cannon founder named Orban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantines. They could not afford to pay him. Orban went to the Ottomans and cast a massive bombard that could throw a stone ball weighing 600 kilograms. The bombard cracked the walls with every shot. The defenders did what they could. They repaired the walls each night with rubble and earth. They used Greek fire in limited quantities. They fought bravely, but the numbers were against them. The Ottoman army numbered at least 60,000 men, probably more. The Byzantine garrison, excluding foreign volunteers, was perhaps 3,000. Even with the Italian and Catalan reinforcements, the total defenders were no more than 8,000. The third failure was psychological. The people of Constantinople had endured centuries of siege and had always been saved. The Avars in 626, the Arabs in 674 and 717, the Bulgars, the Rus, all had been repelled. The city had a reputation for being impregnable. That reputation bred a kind of fatalism. When the siege began, many residents believed that an angel would appear to save them, as prophecy foretold. Others believed that the emperor would miraculously be resurrected. This fatalism undermined the will to fight. Some simply waited. In the final weeks, the emperor made one last appeal to the clergy. He asked them to march in procession with the holy icons, to pray for deliverance. But the anti-unionist monks refused. They accused the emperor of betraying the faith by accepting the Latin Union. The procession was cancelled. The city remained divided even as the walls were being breached. When investigators of the 20th century reconstructed the timeline, they found specific moments where a different decision might have changed the outcome. For example, if the emperor had accepted a proposal to pay Orban for his cannon, the Ottomans might not have had such an effective weapon. If the Genoese colony of Galata, which remained neutral, had actively assisted the defense, the sea walls might have been better guarded. If a Venetian relief fleet had arrived a day earlier, the Ottoman navy might have been forced to lift the blockade. But none of these things happened. The human cost was staggering. Estimates of the dead vary from 4,000 to over 30,000. The number of enslaved is even harder to determine. Many of the upper-class Byzantines were ransomed by relatives in the West. The poor were sold in markets. The city itself was depopulated. Maimed II later ordered families from other parts of the empire to resettle the city, offering tax incentives and free houses. He wanted to make Constantinople, now called Istanbul, the capital of his empire. But the city he inherited was a skeleton. The cultural loss was also enormous. The library of the imperial palace, which contained manuscripts going back to the 4th century, was scattered or destroyed. The Church of the Holy Apostles, which held the tombs of Byzantine emperors, was looted and later demolished. The statue of Justinian that stood in the Augustaion was melted down for cannon. The great bronze horses that had adorned the hippodrome were sent to Venice, where they still stand above the doors of St. Mark's Basilica. And yet, not everything was lost. The Byzantine scholars who fled to Italy brought with them the texts that would spark the Renaissance. Manuel Chrysoloras had already taught Greek in Florence decades earlier. But after 1453, the exodus increased. Bessarion, a Greek scholar who had become a Catholic cardinal, donated his library of over 700 manuscripts to Venice. These texts included works of Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, and Sophocles that had been unknown in the West for centuries. The study of Greek literature flourished. The humanist movement gained momentum. In a strange way, the fall of Constantinople accelerated the intellectual transformation of Europe. The Byzantine Empire had been a repository of ancient knowledge. When the city fell, that knowledge spread outward. It was translated, printed, and disseminated. The printing press had been invented in Mainz around 1450, just 3 years before the fall. The combination of Greek manuscripts and movable type changed the course of Western thought. But the immediate consequence was the consolidation of Ottoman power. With Constantinople in Ottoman hands, the Turks controlled the land routes between Europe and Asia. Trade with the East became more difficult. European merchants began looking for sea routes. Portugal sent ships down the coast of Africa. Spain sent Columbus west. The age of exploration was born from the closure of the Silk Road. The question of what could have been done differently remains a subject of historical debate. Some scholars argue that the empire was doomed regardless of its decisions. The resources of the Ottomans were too great. The demographic and economic gap was too wide. The Byzantine Empire in 1453 was a city-state, not an empire. It could not compete with the Ottomans, who controlled the Balkans, Anatolia, and most of the trade routes. The only hope was a major crusade from the West, and that hope died when the Western kingdoms failed to act. Others point to the empire's internal decay. The bureaucracy was corrupt, the tax system had collapsed, the military was dependent on mercenaries who were often unreliable. The religious schism had sapped the morale of the population. The aristocracy was more interested in preserving its privileges than in defending the state. The common people were alienated from the government. In the last years, many citizens of Constantinople refused to fight because they believed the emperor had sold out to the pope. When you look at the fall from a system's perspective, the pattern is clear. The empire had been in decline for centuries. It had moments of recovery under the Comnenian dynasty in the 12th century, under the Paleologan dynasty in the 14th, but each recovery was temporary. The underlying structural problems, the loss of territory, the decline of trade, the shrinking population, were never solved. The empire lived on borrowed time. So why does the Byzantine Empire still matter? It matters because it shows how civilizations die. They do not die suddenly. They die slowly over generations. The symptoms are visible: declining birth rates, fiscal mismanagement, loss of military capability, cultural despair, religious conflict. The Byzantines saw the signs. They wrote about them. They lamented them. But they could not bring themselves to change. It also matters because the empire preserved something that would otherwise have been lost. The classical tradition of Greece and Rome survived in Constantinople long after it had faded in the West. The legal code of Justinian influenced the laws of modern Europe. The art and architecture of Byzantium shaped the Orthodox world, and, through Russia, a vast part of Asia. The music of the Byzantine liturgy is still sung in churches from Athens to Moscow. The empire's legacy is not in its territory, which is gone, but in its culture, which outlasted the walls. Now step back and consider the moment of the fall itself. At 4 in the morning on May 29th, 1453, a gate was left open. That gate was not the cause of the fall, but it was the final failure in a long chain. If the gate had been locked, the city might have held for another day, maybe another week. It would not have changed the ultimate outcome. The Ottomans would have broken through eventually, but the symbolism is powerful. A civilization that had stood for 1,000 years fell because of a single unlocked gate. The defenders fought until the end. The emperor died in the streets, his body lost among the piles of the dead. The last Byzantine soldier was killed sometime that morning. The last Byzantine citizen was enslaved by evening. The empire was finished. In the centuries that followed, the memory of Constantinople became a symbol for the Christian world. It was a city of gold, of wisdom, of the true faith, lost forever. The dream of reclaiming it persisted for centuries. Crusades were proposed, plans were drawn, but no one ever recaptured the city. The Hagia Sophia remained a mosque until 1935 when it became a museum. In 2020, it was converted back into a mosque. The building still stands, a living monument to the empire that built it. The story of the Byzantine Empire is not a simple story of decline and fall. It is a story of survival against overwhelming odds, of a people who believed they were the chosen of God, who endured sieges, plagues, civil wars, and betrayal. They lasted longer than any other medieval state. They outlasted the caliphates, the Holy Roman Empire, the Mongols, and the Crusader kingdoms. They fell only when they had no more strength to resist. And in the end, what do we learn? We learn that no system is permanent. Every empire eventually falls. The question is not whether it will fall, but how long it can delay the inevitable. The Byzantines delayed it for 1,000 years. That is longer than any other Mediterranean empire except Rome itself. They deserve to be remembered not for their failure, but for their incredible endurance. On the 2nd of June 1453, just 4 days after the walls of Constantinople fell, Sultan Mehmed II entered the Hagia Sophia. He ordered the building to be converted into a mosque. A wooden minaret was hastily built. The Great Dome, which had stood for over 9 centuries as the symbol of Byzantine Christianity, was now adorned with Islamic calligraphy. The mosaics of Christ and the Virgin Mary were covered with plaster. They were not destroyed. They were simply hidden. Some were lost. Others survived beneath the whitewash, only to be uncovered again in the 20th century. The building itself would remain one of the largest and most structurally advanced domes in the world. It still stands. The conversion of the Hagia Sophia was not an act of random destruction. It was a deliberate statement of power. Mehmed wanted to show that the new rulers of the city were Muslims and that the old order was gone. But he also wanted to keep the city alive. He understood that a dead city could not be a capital, so he issued an edict. All Greeks who had fled before the siege were invited to return. Those who had been enslaved could be ransomed. The Patriarch of the Orthodox Church was allowed to remain in office. The Jewish community was allowed to return. The city would not be purely Muslim. It would be Ottoman, which meant a mosaic of religions and ethnicities, all under the Sultan's control. Mehmed also ordered a new palace to be built. The Topkapi Palace, constructed on the site of the old Byzantine Acropolis, became the seat of Ottoman power. The palace was not a fortress. It was a complex of courtyards, gardens, and pavilions. The Sultan lived there with his family, his administrators, and his harem. The Byzantine Palace of Blasharny, which had been the imperial residence for the last centuries, was abandoned and later fell into ruins. The Ottoman capital was physically new, but it sat on the bones of the old empire. Now consider the demographic transformation. In 1453, Constantinople had perhaps 40,000 inhabitants. By the end of the 15th century, under Mehmed's successors, the population rose to over 200,000. It became the largest city in Europe. This was not organic growth. It was planned. Maimed forcibly relocated Armenians, Jews, and Turks from other parts of his empire. He offered tax breaks and land grants. He even brought in artisans from conquered territories to restart the silk industry and shipbuilding. The city became a commercial hub again, but it was no longer the center of a Christian world. It was the center of an Islamic empire that straddled Europe, Asia, and Africa. The question of what happened to the Byzantine elite is often overlooked. Some were killed during the sack, others were ransomed. A few, like the historian Doukas, escaped to the west. Doukas wrote an account of the fall that remains one of our primary sources. He described the terror, the looting, and the death of the emperor. But the old aristocratic families, the Paleologoi, the Cantacuzenoi, the Komnenoi, did not simply vanish. Some converted to Islam and entered Ottoman service. Others fled to the Mora, the last Byzantine holdout in the Peloponnese, which fell a few years later. A branch of the Palaiologos family fled to Italy, where they lived on as exiles. One of them, Andreas Palaiologos, sold his claim to the Byzantine throne to Charles VII of France. The claim was worthless, but it symbolized the end of imperial legitimacy. Meanwhile, the Orthodox Church adapted. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Gennadios Scholarios, was appointed by Maimed himself. The Sultan recognized the Patriarch as the religious leader of all Orthodox Christians in the empire. The Church was allowed to keep its properties, its schools, and its legal authority over marriage and inheritance. This arrangement, known as the Millet system, gave the Orthodox Church a degree of autonomy under Ottoman rule. It also ensured that the Byzantine tradition of liturgy and theology survived. The Church became the keeper of the Byzantine identity. It still is, in many Orthodox countries today. But the most profound legacy of Byzantium was not in Constantinople. It was in Russia. The conversion of the Rus to Christianity in 988 had been the work of Byzantine missionaries. The Cyrillic alphabet, developed by the brothers Cyril and Methodios, was based on Greek. The architecture of early Russian churches copied the cross-and-square plan of Byzantine models. The iconography, the chanting, the theology, all came from Constantinople. When the city fell, Russia saw itself as the successor. The theory of Moscow as the Third Rome emerged. The first Rome had fallen to barbarians. The second Rome, Constantinople, had fallen to the Turks. The third Rome, Moscow, would stand forever. This idea shaped Russian imperial ideology for centuries. It justified the expansion of the Tsarist state and the claim to be the protector of Orthodox Christians. Now step back to the 10th century. In 957, Princess Olga of Kiev visited Constantinople. She was baptized there, taking the name Helena. Her grandson, Vladimir the Great, was baptized in Ninaiday. He married Anna, the sister of the Byzantine Emperor Basil II. This marriage was a political bargain. Basil needed military help to put down a rebellion. Vladimir offered 6,000 warriors in exchange for the princess. but the deeper consequence was the conversion of an entire nation. The Rus adopted Byzantine Christianity, not Latin Christianity. That decision separated them from Western Europe for centuries. It also gave them access to the literature and art of Byzantium. The earliest Russian chronicles, such as the Primary Chronicle, were written in Church Slavonic, based on Byzantine models. The first Russian monasteries followed the rule of Theodore the Studite, a Byzantine monk. In the West, the influence of Byzantine culture was less direct but equally significant. The Renaissance was powered by Greek texts that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries. The humanist scholar Francesco Petrarca, writing in the 14th century, tried to learn Greek but could not find a teacher. He complained that the knowledge of Greek had died out in the West. That changed when Byzantine scholars began traveling to Italy in the 15th century. Manuel Chrysoloras taught Greek in Florence from 1396 to 1400. His students included some of the leading figures of the early Renaissance. One of them, Guarino de Verona, later translated Plutarch and Strabo. Another, Leonardo Bruni, used Greek sources to write a history of Florence. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 accelerated this flow. Bessarion, who had been a high-ranking Byzantine official before converting to Catholicism and becoming a cardinal, settled in Venice. He donated his collection of Greek manuscripts to the city. That collection became the core of the Bibliotheca Martiana. The manuscripts were copied and circulated. The works of Plato, which had been known only in Latin summaries, were now available in full. The works of Aristotle, which had been known through Arabic translations, were now read in the original. The combination of Greek learning and the printing press transformed European education. But not all Byzantine influence was intellectual. The art of mosaic, which had flourished in the churches of Constantinople, influenced the development of Italian mosaic work in Ravenna and Venice. The domed basilicas of San Marco in Venice and the Cathedral of Aachen in Germany were inspired by Byzantine architecture. The iconography of the Madonna and Child, which became so central to Western art, has its roots in the Byzantine Hodgetria icon. The techniques of gold leaf, tempera, and panel painting were passed from Byzantium to Italy. Now ask, how could a civilization that was so influential and so long-lived be reduced to a single city in its final years? The answer lies in its geography and economy. The Byzantine Empire had once stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates. It lost most of its territory to the Arab conquests in the 7th century. It recovered some of it in the 10th and 11th centuries under the Macedonian dynasty. But the loss of Anatolia to the Seljuk Turks after the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 was a turning point. Anatolia was the heartland of the empire. It provided most of the army's recruits and most of the tax revenue. Once it was lost, the empire depended on foreign mercenaries and diplomatic bribes. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 was another wound that never healed. The sack of Constantinople by Latin crusaders shattered the Byzantine state. The empire was divided into small successor states. When the Paleologoi recaptured Constantinople in 1261, the city was ruined. The imperial treasury was empty. The population had shrunk. The navy was gone. The empire never regained its former power. It survived by playing its enemies against each other: the Ottomans, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Venetians, the Genoese. But that game could only last so long. By the early 15th century, the Ottomans had surrounded Constantinople on all sides. The city was an island in a Turkish sea. It could not feed itself. It could not defend itself. It could only hope for rescue. That rescue never came. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, knew the end was near. He wrote letters to the Pope and to the rulers of Europe. He offered to reunite the churches. He promised to accept papal supremacy. Some Western ships and soldiers came, but not enough. The walls held for 53 days. Then they fell. The fall of Constantinople is often described as the end of the Middle Ages. It is a convenient marker. But the Byzantine Empire did not simply end in 143. Its legacy continued in the Orthodox Church, in the law codes of Europe, in the art of the Renaissance, in the alphabet of Russia, in the architecture of Venice, in the manuscripts of the Vatican. The empire's last breath was not a gasp. It was a transmission. The knowledge that had been preserved in Greek was passed to the West. The faith that had been shaped by the ecumenical councils was passed to the Slavic world. The idea of a universal Christian empire, modeled on Rome, was passed to the Russians, the Habsburgs, and later to the idea of a united Europe. In the end, the question is not why the Byzantine Empire fell. It is how it lasted so long. It survived the barbarian invasions, the Persian wars, the Arab sieges, the iconoclast controversy, the Frankish crusaders, the Black Death, the civil wars, and the Ottoman expansion. It lasted 1,123 years from the foundation of Constantinople in 330 to its fall in 143. That is longer than any other institution in European history. The empire was not a failure. It was an endurance. And its legacy, scattered across 3 continents, still shapes the world we live in today. At dawn on the 26th of August in the year 1071, on a dusty plain near the fortress of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, the Byzantine army formed its battle lines. The Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes commanded approximately 40,000 men. The Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan had perhaps 30,000. For days, negotiations had failed. The emperor had demanded the return of lost fortresses. The Sultan had offered a truce and favorable terms. Romanos refused. Now the armies would meet. The Byzantine army was a composite force. It included professional troops from the Tagmata, the imperial guard units stationed in Constantinople. It included thematic levies from the provinces of Anatolia and Thrace. It included mercenaries from the Normans, Franks, Pechenegs, and Varangians. The Varangians were mostly Anglo-Saxon exiles who had fled after the Norman conquest of England in 1006. They carried large axes and wore chain mail. They were considered the best infantry in the empire. The Seljuk army was lighter and faster. Their primary weapon was the composite bow, fired from horseback. Their tactics relied on mobility, feigned retreats, and encirclement. They did not seek a direct confrontation with heavily armored Byzantine infantry unless they could draw them out of formation. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the Byzantine army began its advance from the fortified camp. Romanos had ordered the troops to march in a deep, dense formation. The left wing was commanded by the general Nikephoros Bryennios. The right wing was commanded by the general Theodore Alyates. The center was held by the emperor himself, surrounded by the Varangians and the elite Scalae. The rearguard, tasked with protecting the supply train and preventing encirclement, was commanded by Andronikos Doukas, a cousin of the emperor's political rival Michael Doukas. By midday, the two armies had made contact. The Seljuk skirmishers harassed the Byzantine flanks, firing arrows, and then withdrawing before the Byzantine cavalry could respond. Romanos ordered his cavalry to drive them back. Each time, the Seljuks retreated, drawing the Byzantines further from their main body. This was a classic steppe tactic. The emperor, inexperienced in warfare against nomadic armies, did not recognize the pattern. At around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Romanos gave the order for a general advance. The entire Byzantine line moved forward. The Seljuks fell back, still firing arrows. The Byzantine infantry, exhausted and thirsty in the August heat, began to slow down. The gaps in the formation widened. The emperor, seeing the enemy retreat, believed victory was near. He sent messengers to the rearguard, ordering Andronikos Doukas to advance and support the main force. What happened next? Andronikos Doukas did not move. He remained in place, positioned on a hill overlooking the battlefield. He later claimed he had not received the order. But the chroniclers who wrote the history of the battle, Michael Italyates and Nikephoros Bryennios, both recorded that Doukas deliberately held back. He was a Doukas, a member of the powerful clan that had been displaced by Romanos. He had reason to see the emperor fail. Whether it was treason or incompetence is still debated. The result was the same. At around 4 o'clock, the Seljuk cavalry executed a wide encirclement. They swung around the Byzantine right flank, cut off the retreat, and fell on the rear of the army. The Byzantine left wing broke. The right wing collapsed soon after. The center, isolated, was surrounded. The Varangians fought until their axes broke. The Emperor Romanos, wounded in the shoulder, continued to fight on foot. His horse was killed under him. A Seljuk warrior captured him alive. The sun set over a field of dead Byzantines. Nearly half the army was lost. The rest scattered or were taken prisoner. Andronikos Doukas fled the battlefield with the rearguard intact. He later claimed he had saved what remained of the army, but he also ensured that no relief force could rescue the emperor. When the news reached Constantinople, the Doukas family immediately moved to depose Romanos. They crowned Michael Doukas as emperor. The captured emperor was later released by Alp Arslan after a ransom was paid, but he was blinded and exiled. He died within a year. Now step back and look at the consequences. Manzikert was not the first defeat of a Byzantine army. The empire had lost battles before, but this defeat was catastrophic because of what followed. The loss of the emperor and the destruction of the field army left Anatolia defenseless. The Seljuks did not immediately occupy the entire region. They were not prepared for long-term conquest, but the Byzantine defense system had been destroyed. The thematic armies which had protected the frontier for centuries could not be rebuilt quickly. The government in Constantinople, distracted by civil war, did not send reinforcements. Within a decade, the Seljuks began moving into Anatolia. They captured cities, established garrisons, and settled nomadic tribes. The Byzantine population, left without protection, either fled or submitted. The process was slow at first. But by the end of the 11th century, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum controlled most of central Anatolia. The Byzantines held only the coastal regions and the western valleys. The heartland of the empire, the source of its soldiers and taxes, was gone. How could this have happened? The question leads to a deeper examination of the Byzantine military system. For centuries, the empire had relied on the theme system. Each province provided soldiers who were paid in land. These soldiers were motivated to defend their own homes. They were experienced and loyal, but the theme system had been weakened by the previous century. The emperors of the Macedonian dynasty had used more mercenaries and fewer native troops. The conquests in the east had stretched the budget. The land grants had been converted to cash payments, which were often delayed. The soldiers were less reliable. Manzikert exposed that weakness. The Byzantine army was not a national army. It was a coalition of mercenaries and conscripts from different cultures. The Normans, Franks, Pechenegs, and Varangians had no loyalty to the emperor beyond their pay. When the battle turned, they fled. The thematic troops who might have held the line were understrength and poorly equipped. The chain of command was broken by political rivalry. The rearguard commander, Andronikos Doukas, was more concerned with his family's power than with the safety of the empire. The aftermath of Manzikert set in motion events that would define the next 4 centuries. The Byzantine Empire lost its ability to project power in the east. It became a minor player in Anatolia, dependent on diplomacy and bribery. The loss of Anatolia also shifted the empire's focus to the Balkans and the Aegean. This left Constantinople vulnerable to attacks from both the east and the west. But the most immediate consequence of Manzikert was the call for help from the west. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who came to power in 1081, saw the Seljuks advancing toward the Sea of Marmara. He sent letters to Pope Urban II asking for mercenary troops. The Pope saw an opportunity. He called for a crusade. In 1096, the First Crusade arrived in Constantinople. The Crusaders were not the disciplined soldiers Alexios had expected. They were armed pilgrims, ambitious nobles, and violent adventurers. They plundered the countryside and attacked Byzantine officials. Alexios managed to send them into Anatolia, where they captured cities like Nicaea and Antioch. But the Crusaders did not return those cities to the empire. They established their own kingdoms. The relationship between Byzantium and the Crusaders became one of suspicion and betrayal. The Byzantines saw the Crusaders as barbarians. The Crusaders saw the Byzantines as deceitful Greeks. This tension culminated in the Fourth Crusade of 1204, when the Crusaders turned on Constantinople and sacked the city. That event, which the draft already mentions, was a direct consequence of the erosion of Byzantine power after Manzikert. Now consider the human scale. The soldiers who died at Manzikert were not only numbers, they were farmers, artisans, and fathers from themes like Cappadocia, Galatia, and Paphlagonia. Their families never saw them again. The villages they defended fell to Turkish raids. The churches they built were converted into mosques or abandoned. The Greek language slowly faded from the interior. The Orthodox faith persisted in the monasteries, but the rural population converted or fled. By the 13th century, much of Anatolia was Muslim and Turkish-speaking. One survivor of the battle, the chronicler Michael Italietes, wrote that the defeat was caused by the sins of the empire. He blamed the arrogance of the emperor and the treachery of the Daucus clan. He wrote that the army had been poorly led and poorly supplied. He noted that the soldiers had not eaten properly for 2 days before the battle. He recorded that the emperor, before being captured, had tried to rally his troops by shouting that Christ was with them. But the troops did not listen. They ran. The Battle of Manzikert remains a study in how one event can change the trajectory of a civilization. It was not the end of Byzantium. The empire survived for another 382 years, but it was the moment when the Byzantine Empire lost its status as a great power. It became a small state, struggling to survive, surrounded by enemies who were stronger, faster, and more unified. The empire that had once recovered from defeats in the 7th century could not recover from this one. The system had changed. The resources were gone. The will was broken. In the end, the question is not why the Byzantine Empire fell in 153. It is why it did not fall earlier. The answer lies in the resilience of its institutions, the bureaucracy, the church, the law, the diplomacy. But even those could not compensate for the loss of Anatolia. The empire became a head without a body. It lived on memory and ritual. And memory, no matter how powerful, cannot feed an army or rebuild a wall. The sun that set on the plain of Manzikert in 1071 set also on the idea of a universal Christian empire in the East. The empire would continue, diminished but stubborn, for centuries. But the seeds of its final collapse were planted that day. The roots of the Fourth Crusade, the Ottoman conquest, and the end of the Byzantine state all trace back to that August afternoon when a rearguard commander decided not to move. On the 1st of April, 1081, a young general named Alexios Komnenos seized the throne of Constantinople. He was 33 years old. The empire he inherited was barely holding together. The Seljuks had reached the Sea of Marmara. Norman adventurers had invaded the Balkans. The treasury was empty. The army had been destroyed at Manzikert. Alexios had no fleet, no reserves, and little loyalty from the provincial governors. He took the crown anyway. What happened next was not a rapid recovery. It was a long, desperate struggle to survive. Alexios spent the first decade of his reign fighting on three fronts. He hired mercenaries from the Pecheneg steppes. He bribed the Seljuks with gold. He made deals with the Venetians for naval support. He married his daughter Anna to a Caesar from the old Doukas family to neutralize his rivals. He was not a reformer in the grand sense. He was a pragmatist. He did whatever kept the empire alive for another year. The most famous decision of Alexios's reign was the appeal to the West. In 1095, he sent an embassy to Pope Urban II at the Council of Piacenza. He asked for mercenaries, not a crusade. The Pope turned the request into a holy war. The First Crusade arrived at Constantinople in 1096. Alexios had not planned for 60,000 armed pilgrims. He did not trust them. He demanded their leaders swear oaths of fealty. He provided guides and supplies. Then he sent them into Anatolia, hoping they would weaken the Seljuks. They did. The Crusaders captured Nicaea, Antioch, and Jerusalem, but they also created their own states. The Byzantine Empire regained some coastal cities, but not the interior. The Crusader principalities became a new problem. By the time Alexios died in 1118, the empire was stable but not strong. The army had been rebuilt around a core of foreign mercenaries and native troops. The treasury had a surplus. The borders were defended, but the underlying weakness remained. The empire was dependent on Venice for naval transport. The provinces were governed by military families who were loyal to the Komnenos dynasty but not to the state. The loss of Anatolia had not been reversed. The themes were gone. The old system of citizen soldiers had been replaced by a feudal structure. The empire could fight wars, but it could not win them decisively. Alexios's son John II Komnenos took the throne in 109. He was a different kind of emperor. He did not enjoy palace intrigue. He preferred the camp. He spent most of his reign on campaign, fighting the Seljuks, the Pechenegs, and the Crusader states. He was called John the Beautiful by his soldiers. He died in 1143 after being accidentally poisoned by a hunting arrow. His death was a turning point. His son Manuel I Komnenos inherited a well-trained army and a full treasury. Manuel was ambitious. He wanted to be a new Justinian. He planned to restore the empire's borders to the Mediterranean coast. He invaded Hungary. He fought the Normans in Italy. He tried to control the Crusader states. He allied with the Pope. He was constantly at war. Manuel's reign was a paradox. The army was large and well-equipped. The navy was modernized. The diplomacy was aggressive, but the results were mixed. In 1176, Manuel led a massive expedition against the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan II. He invaded Anatolia with an army of 30,000 men. He advanced toward the fortress of Myriokphalon. The terrain was mountainous. The Seljuks waited at a narrow pass. They ambushed the Byzantine column. The army was shattered. Manuel barely escaped. He had to destroy the fortifications he had built at Dorylaeum. The Battle of Myriokphalon was not massacred. The emperor was not captured. The army was not annihilated, but the strategic result was the same. The Byzantine offensive into Anatolia was over. The Seljuks remained in control of the interior. Manuel died in 1080. His death triggered a period of instability. His son Alexios II was a child. The regency was corrupt. The nobility rebelled. In 1185, another revolt brought the Komnenos dynasty to an end. The new emperor, Isaac II Angelos, was incompetent. He spent his reign fighting off rebellions and foreign invasions. The empire was falling apart. The Third Crusade passed through Byzantine territory in 1190, led by Frederick Barbarossa. The Byzantines tried to obstruct him. Frederick invaded Thrace. A war broke out. The empire had to pay heavy indemnities. By the end of the 12th century, the Byzantine Empire was a wreck. The army was small. The treasury was empty. The provinces were controlled by local magnates who obeyed the emperor only when it suited them. The Crusader states in Syria were hostile. The Normans in Sicily had sacked Thessalonica in 108. The Seljuks in Anatolia raided at will. The only reliable ally was Venice, and Venice was not an ally. Venice was a creditor. Then came the Fourth Crusade. On the 23rd of June, 1203, a fleet of ships appeared off the coast of Constantinople. There were about 200 vessels. They carried an army of about 10,000 Crusaders and Venetians. The Crusaders had originally planned to attack Egypt, but they had run out of money. The Venetians had offered to transport them, but the Crusaders could not pay the full price. So the Venetians proposed a different plan. They would help the Crusaders restore the Byzantine Prince Alexios Angelos to the throne. In exchange, the prince would pay the debt and provide troops for the crusade. The Byzantine emperor at the time was Alexios III Angelos, uncle of the young prince. He was not prepared. The Crusaders landed on the Asian shore. They broke the chain across the Golden Horn. They assaulted the walls. Alexios III fled the city. The citizens of Constantinople released the imprisoned Emperor Isaac II from prison. They crowned him again. His son, the young Alexios, became co-emperor as Alexios IV. The Crusaders were welcomed. They expected payment. Alexios IV could not pay. The treasury was empty. He tried to raise money by confiscating church treasures and taxing the people. The citizens hated him. In January 1204, a revolt broke out. Alexios IV was strangled. The new emperor, Alexios V. Doukas, refused to pay the Crusaders. The Crusaders decided to attack. On the 13th of April 1204, they breached the land walls. They sacked the city for 3 days. They destroyed churches, libraries, and palaces. They raped and killed. They divided the empire among themselves. The Byzantine Empire was replaced by a Latin empire. A Greek exile state formed in Nicaea, another in Epirus, and a third in Trebizond. The Fourth Crusade was not an accident. It was the result of decades of Byzantine mismanagement, Venetian greed, and Crusader ambition. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was the single most destructive event in Byzantine history. It broke the spine of the empire. The city was looted of its art, its relics, and its gold. The libraries were burned. The aristocracy was scattered. The church was divided between a Latin patriarch and a Greek patriarch in exile. The empire would be restored in 1261, but it was never the same. After the recovery, the Paleologan dynasty ruled a diminished state. The emperors were competent administrators but weak generals. They had no army to speak of. They depended on mercenaries, mostly Catalans and Turks. The Catalan company revolted in 13 They ravaged Thrace. The Turks began to raid the Aegean coast. The empire became a city-state. The provinces were lost. The treasury used the last Venetian loans to pay for short-term survival. By the 14th century, the Byzantine Empire was a pawn in a larger game. The Seljuks had been replaced by the Ottomans. The Ottomans were more organized, more determined, and more patient. They took Gallipoli in 1354. They took Adrianople in 1360. They surrounded Constantinople. The Byzantine emperor became a vassal, paying tribute, providing troops for Ottoman campaigns. A few emperors tried to resist, but they lacked resources. In 1396, the Ottomans defeated a crusade at Nicopolis. In 1402, they were defeated by Timur at Ankara. That gave Byzantium a half-century reprieve. But the Ottomans recovered. The final siege began on the 6th of April, 1453. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II assembled an army of about 80,000 men. He had a navy of about 120 ships. He had a massive cannon that could throw stone balls weighing 600 kilograms. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos had about 7,000 defenders. The city walls were old but strong. The defenders held out for 53 days. The final assault came on the 29th of May. The Ottomans breached the walls at the St. Romanus Gate. Constantine XI died fighting. The city fell. The fall of Constantinople was not a surprise. It was the inevitable conclusion of a long decline. The empire had lost its army, its territory, its wealth, and its allies. The sack of 1204 had fatally wounded it. The Paleologan restoration was a holding action. The empire survived because the Ottomans were distracted by their own civil wars. When those wars ended, the empire ended. The questions that remain are not about why the empire fell. They are about why it lasted so long. The Byzantine Empire endured for 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. It survived the Arab invasions of the 7th century. It survived the Bulgarian wars of the 9th and 10th centuries. It survived the Seljuk conquest of Anatolia in the 11th. It survived the Fourth Crusade and the Latin occupation. It survived the Black Death and the Ottoman advance. It survived because of its bureaucracy, its diplomacy, its orthodox faith, and its walls. But those walls could not hold forever. The empire that began as a Roman province became the longest-lived state of the medieval world. It preserved the works of Aristotle and Plato. It developed Roman law. It invented the Greek fire. It built the Hagia Sophia. It defined the Eastern Christian world. But in the end, it was too small, too old, and too exhausted to resist a new power that was young, aggressive, and unified. The sun that set on Constantinople on the 29th of May 1453 had already set on Rome in 476. But the Byzantine sunset was longer, more patient, and more complete. The empire did not fall in one battle. It fell in 1,000 years of battle, siege, betrayal, and survival. The story of Byzantium is the story of a civilization that refused to die until it had no choice. On the 15th of June, 1341, the Emperor Andronikos III Palaiologos died in Constantinople. He was 56 years old. He had reigned for 12 years. His death was not sudden. He had been ill for months. But the timing could not have been worse. His son and heir, John V. Palaiologos, was only 9 years old. The empire was at war with the Serbian kingdom of Stefan Dušan, who had already taken much of Macedonia. The treasury was empty. The army was a skeleton. And the regency that took control of the young emperor was divided from the start. The regency was led by the Empress Anna of Savoy, the boy's mother. She was supported by the patriarch John Xiv Kailkas and the powerful Megas du Alexios Apokakos. They were inexperienced, suspicious, and ambitious. They distrusted the most powerful man in the empire, John Cantacuzenios, the Megas Domestikos, the commander of the army. He had been the closest friend and chief minister of the late emperor. He had negotiated the peace with the Serbs. He had rebuilt the fleet. He had led campaigns against the Ottomans. He was the obvious choice to lead the regency. But the empress and the patriarch feared his power. They moved against him. In September of 1341, Cantacuzenios was at his estate in Didymoticho, in Thrace. He received a letter from the regency ordering him to resign his command. He refused. Instead, on the 26th of October, his army proclaimed him emperor. He did not take the title immediately. He claimed to be acting as regent for the young John V, but the regency in Constantinople declared him a rebel. A civil war began. The war lasted 6 years. It was not a clean conflict between two sides. It was a complex web of shifting alliances, foreign interventions, and social upheaval. Cantacuzenios had the support of the provincial aristocracy, the landowners, and the soldiers. The regency had the support of the bureaucracy, the church, and the people of Constantinople. But neither side had enough resources to win alone. Both sides called in outsiders. Cantacuzeno's turned to Stefan Dušan of Serbia. Dušan agreed to help, but only in exchange for territory. By 1343, Cantacuzenos had allied with Dušan and with the Turkish emir of Aydin, Umar Bey. The regency turned to the Bulgarian Tsar and to the Genoese colony of Galata. The war became a free-for-all. The countryside of Thrace and Macedonia was ravaged by Serbian, Turkish, Bulgarian, and Byzantine armies. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed. The population fled to fortified towns or across the sea. In 1345, a turning point came. The Regency had arrested and executed several supporters of Cantacuzenos, including his mother and sister. They were strangled in prison. Cantacuzenos responded by formally declaring himself emperor as John VI. He now had no interest in reconciliation. He pressed the war harder. He began to use Turkish mercenaries more freely. He granted them permission to settle in Thrace. They raided indiscriminately, looting both regency and neutral territory. The local population suffered equally. What happened next changed the course of Byzantine history. In 1347, Cantacuzenos finally entered Constantinople. The city was starved and exhausted. The regency surrendered. John VI Cantacuzenos was crowned co-emperor with the young John V, but the cost was devastating. The Serbs had taken all of Macedonia and much of Albania. The Bulgarians had taken the northern Black Sea coast. The Turks were entrenched in Thrace, and the Black Death arrived. The plague reached Constantinople in the summer of 1347. It killed perhaps a third of the population. The city had already lost its trade routes to the Genoese. Its population had been declining for decades. Now it plunged further. The empire could not recover. Cantacuzenos tried to rebuild. He negotiated a marriage between his daughter Helena and the young John V. He attempted to restore the economy by regulating prices and suppressing corruption. But his position was weak. The Turkish mercenaries he had brought into Thrace refused to leave. They established their own petty emirates. In 1352, a new civil war broke out between John V and his father-in-law. John Cantacuzenos called in more Turkish troops, this time from the Ottoman Emirate in Bithynia. The Ottomans crossed into Europe for the first time in 1352, fighting on the side of Cantacuzenos. They were led by Suleiman, the son of the Ottoman Sultan Orhan. They were given the fortress of Tzimp on the Gallipoli Peninsula as a base. That was the mistake that ended the empire. On the 2nd of March, 1354, a powerful earthquake struck the Gallipoli Peninsula. The walls of the Byzantine fortress at Gallipoli collapsed. The townspeople fled. The Ottoman Turks who were still in the area moved in. They occupied the fortress. They rebuilt the walls. They brought in settlers from Anatolia. When the Byzantine authorities demanded they leave, the Ottomans refused. Sultan Orhan claimed that the land was given to them by God through the earthquake. There was nothing the Byzantines could do. The Ottoman occupation of Gallipoli was not just a loss of a single fortress. It was the first permanent Ottoman foothold in Europe. From that point on, the empire could not dislodge them. The Ottomans had a direct land route into Thrace. They could bring armies across the Dardanelles without needing a fleet. They could raid, conquer, and settle at will. The Byzantine civil wars had opened the door. How could a government so experienced in diplomacy make such a fundamental error? The answer lies in the nature of Byzantine statecraft. For centuries, the empire had controlled its enemies by playing them against each other. The Turks were divided into many emirates. The Byzantines had used alliances with the Ottomans against the Serbs, and with the Serbs against the Bulgarians. But they had lost the ability to project enough force to keep the balance. In the 1340s, they were desperate. They had no army, no money, and no allies except those they paid with land. The Ottomans were not the most dangerous enemy at the time. The Serbs were, but the Ottomans were the most patient. The aftermath of the civil wars left the Byzantine Empire as a rump state. The Emperor John V. Palaiologos, having finally deposed Cantacuzenios in 1354, ruled a territory that consisted of little more than Constantinople, a few towns in Thrace, and some islands in the Aegean. He spent his reign traveling to the courts of Western Europe, begging for help. He went to Rome, to Avignon, to Naples, to Venice. He offered to convert to Catholicism in exchange for a crusade. The Pope was interested, but the European kings were not. The 100 Years' War distracted France and England. The papacy was in exile. No one came. In 1362, the Ottomans captured Adrianople, the second largest city in the Byzantine Balkans. They renamed it Edirne and made it their capital. The road to Constantinople was now open. The Serbs were defeated at the Battle of Maritsa in 137 on. The Bulgarians were crushed in 1393. The Byzantines were left alone, surrounded by Ottoman territory. By 1394, Sultan Bayezid I began a blockade of Constantinople. He built a fortress on the Asian shore, Anadolu Hisari. The city could not be starved out completely, but it was cut off from its food supply. The Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos, the son of John V, went to Europe in 1399. He visited Paris, London, and the imperial court in Germany. He returned with promises but no soldiers. Then came the intervention of Timur. The Mongol conqueror defeated Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara in 1402. The Ottoman Empire collapsed into a civil war of its own. Constantinople was saved for another 50 years. The Byzantines recovered some territory in Thrace and the Peloponnese. They rebuilt the walls. They negotiated with the Ottoman princes who fought each other for the throne. But the respite was temporary. The Ottoman state was rebuilt under Sultan Mehmed I and his son Murad II. By 1422, Murad II laid siege to Constantinople again. The walls held, but just barely. The final decades were a slow decline. The Emperor John VII Palaiologos negotiated the Council of Florence in 1439, where the Byzantine Church accepted papal supremacy in exchange for a union of the churches and a crusade. The union was unpopular in Constantinople. The people said they would rather see the Sultan's turban than the Pope's tiara. The crusade came in 1444, led by King Ladislaus of Poland and Hungary. It was destroyed at the Battle of Varna. The Ottomans continued their advance. By 1451, the Ottoman Sultan was maimed II. He was 21 years old. He was determined to take Constantinople. He built a new fortress on the European shore, Rumeli Hisari, in one for Fivetwo. It controlled the narrowest point of the Bosphorus. Any ship trying to bring supplies to Constantinople would be sunk. The Emperor Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor, appealed for help. He received a few hundred soldiers from Genoa and Venice. He sent a desperate plea to the Pope. The Pope sent 2 ships. On the 5th of April 1453, the Ottoman army arrived before the walls. The siege began. Inside the city there was a population of about 50,000 people. Only about 7,000 were capable of bearing arms. The walls were old but still strong. The defenders fought with courage. They repaired breaches. They repelled assaults. They held for 53 days. On the night of the 28th of May, the final attack began. The Emperor Constantine addressed his commanders. He spoke of the city's history, its churches, its tombs of emperors. He asked them to die with honor. Then he went to the walls. The Ottomans came in waves. The first wave was the irregular troops, the Azabs. They were slaughtered. The second wave was the Anatolian infantry. They breached the outer wall at the St. Romanus Gate. The defenders held the inner wall. The third wave was the Janissaries, the elite corps. They found a small door left open by accident, the Kirkaporta. They poured through. The fighting was hand-to-hand. The Emperor Constantine XI threw off his imperial insignia and fought as a common soldier. He was last seen near the gate of St. Romanus, surrounded by Ottomans. His body was never identified. By dawn, the city had fallen. The Sultan entered the Hagia Sophia and declared it a mosque. The Byzantine Empire was over. The questions that remain are not about the final battle. They are about the long slide that led to it. The Civil War of 1341 to 1347 was not an accident. It was the result of a system that concentrated power in a single family but could not manage a succession. The regency was corrupt and incompetent. The general was ambitious and ruthless. The foreign powers were happy to exploit the chaos. The Ottomans were not the strongest enemy in 1341. They were the most patient. They waited. They took land. They settled. They built. By the time the Byzantines realized what had happened, it was too late. The empire that had survived the Arab sieges of the 7th century, the Bulgarian wars of the 10th, and the Fourth Crusade of 1204 could not survive itself. The walls of Constantinople were the strongest in the medieval world. But they could not protect against internal decay. The civil wars of the 14th century drained the empire of its last reserves of men, money, and morale. The Black Death killed the survivors. The Ottomans finished the work. In the end, the Byzantine Empire fell not because of a single siege or a single battle. It fell because it had lost the ability to make decisions that would keep it alive. The civil wars of the 1340s were the death blow. Everything after was just the dying. The empire could not reform. It could not raise taxes without rebellion. It could not recruit soldiers without money. It could not defend its borders without allies. It could not find allies without converting to Catholicism, which it could not do without splitting its society. Every option was blocked. Every path led to the same end. The story of Byzantium is the story of a civilization that refused to die until it had no choice. But that refusal cost it everything. It survived the Arab invasions because it had the themes, the military provinces, and the icons. It survived the Bulgarians because it had the diplomacy and the gold. It survived the Seljuks because it had the Komnenian army. It survived the Fourth Crusade because it had the will to rebuild in Nicaea. But by the 14th century, the tools were gone. The themes were broken by the civil wars. The gold was spent on Turkish mercenaries. The army was a shadow. The will was fractured between unionists and anti-unionists, between the poor and the rich, between the capital and the provinces. The empire died as it had lived, slowly, painfully, and with immense dignity. The last emperor died fighting. The last siege was a masterpiece of defense. The last generations of Byzantines knew they were the end of something, and they still chose to fight. They could have surrendered. They could have fled. They did not. They chose the walls. That choice is what we remember. The empire built the Hagia Sophia, preserved the classics, codified the law, and held the gate of Europe for 1,000 years. The gate fell, but the light did not go out. It scattered. The scholars who fled Constantinople to Italy brought the Greek manuscripts that ignited the Renaissance. The Orthodox Church continued in the Balkans and Russia. The memory of Byzantium shaped the identity of Greece, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe. The empire is gone, but its echoes are still audible. The sun that set on Constantinople on the 29th of May 1453 had set on many empires before. It would set on many more. But few empires had cast such a long shadow. The Byzantine Empire was Rome in the East. It was the continuation of imperial authority, the guardian of civilization, the shield of Christendom. It is gone. Its story remains. On the 29th of May 1453, at approximately 10 in the morning, Sultan Mehmed II entered the city of Constantinople through the gate of St. Romanus. The fighting had stopped. The streets were filled with bodies. The looting had already begun. Mehmed rode directly to the Hagia Sophia. He found the great church filled with refugees who had locked themselves inside, hoping for a miracle. The Sultan ordered the doors broken down. He declared the church a mosque. The first call to prayer was made from its pulpit. The Christian empire was replaced by an Islamic one. What happened next was not random destruction. Maimed II wanted a functioning capital. He needed Constantinople to become Istanbul, the new center of his empire. He issued orders to stop the looting after 3 days. He repopulated the city by forcing Muslims, Christians, and Jews from other parts of his realm to move there. He established a system of millets, or religious communities, that allowed the Orthodox Patriarch to continue governing the Christian population. The Church of the Holy Apostles, where Byzantine emperors had been buried for centuries, was given to the Patriarch, but within decades it was torn down and replaced by a mosque. The city was rebuilt, but the change was irreversible. The immediate human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands died in the siege and sack. The survivors were enslaved, ransomed, or forced into labor. The last emperor's body was never found. The Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, who had led the defense with brilliance, was wounded and evacuated. He died of his wounds a few days later on the island of Chios. The Venetian doctors who had treated the wounded were captured and ransomed. The great Byzantine libraries were scattered. Manuscripts that had survived the iconoclasm and the Fourth Crusade were burned, sold, or taken west. The political consequences were immediate and long-lasting. The fall of Constantinople sent a shockwave across Europe. For centuries, the city had been the bulwark of Christendom against Islam. Now it was gone. The Pope called for a new crusade, but no major European power responded. The Holy Roman Empire was distracted by internal conflicts. France and England were recovering from the 100 Years' War. The Italian city-states were more interested in trade with the Ottomans than in fighting them. The Crusade of 1456, led by John Hunyadi, managed to lift the siege of Belgrade but could not retake Constantinople. The intellectual consequences were profound. Greek scholars fled to Italy, bringing with them manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, and the great classical historians. They had been doing this for decades before 1453, but the fall accelerated the exodus. These scholars found patronage in Florence, Rome, and Venice. They taught the Greek language, translated texts, and influenced the Renaissance. The Byzantine legacy became a foundation of modern European thought. Without them, the recovery of classical knowledge might have taken much longer. The fall also transformed the Ottoman Empire. Maimed II saw himself as the heir of both the Roman and the Islamic empires. He took the title Kaisari Rum, Caesar of Rome. He rebuilt the city as his capital, constructing the Topkapi Palace, the Grand Bazaar, and the mosque that bears his name, the Fatih Mosque. He invited the Orthodox Patriarch to remain in the city. He allowed the Genoese and Venetian merchants to continue trading under strict Ottoman control. The empire became a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. Why does this event still matter? The fall of Constantinople is often marked as the end of the Middle Ages. It is a dividing line, but not a clean one. The Byzantine Empire had been dying for decades. The siege itself was not a surprise. The wall was breached by cannon, but the fatal flaw was not the stone. It was the lack of men to defend it. The empire had been drained by civil war, economic collapse, and the Black Death. The siege of 1453 was the final act of a long tragedy whose roots lay in the 1340s. There are unanswered questions. Could the empire have survived if John V had not been captured in the Civil War? Could the union of churches have been achieved earlier and brought meaningful Western aid? Could the empire have reformed its tax system and military recruitment before it was too late? These are questions of counterfactual history. The evidence suggests that by the time the crisis was recognized, the empire was already too weak to save itself. The Civil War of 1341 to 1347 was not the only cause of the fall, but it was the decisive one. It broke the military, emptied the treasury, and handed the initiative to the Ottomans. The legacy of Byzantium is not only in the Hagia Sophia or the Greek manuscripts. It is in the legal traditions of Eastern Europe, the religious practices of the Orthodox world, and the memory of a civilization that held the gate for a millennium. The Byzantine Empire is gone. Its story remains, not as a cautionary tale but as a testament to endurance. The sun that set on Constantinople in 1453 had set on Rome itself 1,000 years earlier. But the light did not go out. It scattered across the Mediterranean and into the future.